Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Mind Matters. Today, we're going to be talking about capitalism. Specifically, we're going to reference the book we started discussing last week. What was that book called, Corey?
The Victory of Reason
By Rodney Stark.
by Rodney Stark, yeah.
Right. So in the book, he talks about the kind of rise of capitalism, and it's one of the points that one of the things that he says was kind of made possible by Christianity, and one of the kind of things that we should look at. One of the positive developments we should look at when we think in terms of our, Christian history in Western civilization. So we're going to look at some of the things that he said about all that, and maybe get into some more just kind of general ideas about capitalism and the kind of critique of capitalism, because it's really I've found recently, especially being more aware and following more the kind of culture wars and the battle between the left and the right and the polarization that capitalism gets raised a lot, and it always has been within the academic community, at least, is a point of contention. On the one hand, you have the people saying that all the greatest things in modern civilization come about from capitalism, and then you get the critique that says that, well, actually no, capitalism doesn't do anything good, and it's actually responsible for everything bad in the world. So there's kind of a corollary, like an analogy to be made, or a connection to what we discussed last week, which was the kind of the view of Christianity, and how many people will see Christianity as being a totally bad thing historically and in the present, whereas a guy like Rodney Stark comes along and says, well, hey, wait a minute, let's look at the actual history, and when you do that, you see that there are actually some positive developments that have come because of the rise of Christianity. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Maybe I'll turn it over to you, Corey, and just ask, what exactly does Stark talk about in his book? So, like, how does he see the rise of capitalism in Europe, and how does he kind of relate it to Christianity?
Well, the main thing that he points out, like, just to start off, he says that capitalism as a term really came about as a derogatory way of viewing the Western economic system.
Yeah.
So, to define it, it's kind of like defining the word jerk, a bunch of jerks, a bunch of capitalists. But capital originally came about, and the word itself came out in the 14th century to describe using money to make money. And it was, an entirely very rational pursuit, a way of using funds for something besides consumption, which was radically different from, at Greco-Roman times when, if you had extra money, then you were going to use it to consume and to, throw lavish parties, and because you have to show off your social status, because social status was extremely important. Whereas in Christianity, as we discussed last week, as St. Paul said, there is no Greek nor Jew, no rich nor slave in Christ. So in that sense, social status wasn't nearly as important, and rather what mattered was works. And so with the collapse of Rome, so many historians look at the collapse of Rome and think that the Dark Ages must have followed because Rome was so great, Imperial Rome, fantastic. But as Rodney Stark points out, he has kind of he takes a people's history perspective on it, and he says, well, actually, Rome was this giant bloated beast that just sucked the wealth and labor and slaves from the borderlands and wasted tons and tons of human energy just for maintaining this giant bureaucratic empire. And when it collapsed, in the pursuing centuries, when people were rebuilding, they actually had a great amount of freedom to tinker and to find ways to improve their lives without having to worry about their wealth being appropriated by the Roman elite. And so just that in and of itself was just a huge breath of fresh air for people who were rebuilding and just tinkering with new ways of growing their crops and, working with the horses. And he points out that one of the biggest improvements early on was the use of like water mills and windmills in order to create just basic necessities. Like they used that technology to make paper and numerous other things to provide basic energy and just for manufacturing in and of itself. So that kind of ingenuity and that practice of of using innovations in order to make life better was a basic precursor to the rise of capitalism, because you couldn't have capital, excess funds, without just being able to work efficiently and make enough money in order to
produce enough to make
produce
money.
enough in order to have excess funds. But then once they had those excess funds, what they did, what took place in the early monasteries, as we discussed last week, was that the monks started using that money to prepare greater estates and to prepare for the future of their estates, and reinvesting it in local technologies and in different ways of manufacturing and growing enough crops in order to feed not just themselves but also the surrounding population. And so I got a couple good quotes in here. As Stark writes, the monks did more than invest in land or lend from their bursting treasuries. They began to leave their fields, vines, and barns and retire into liturgical work, conducting endless paid masses for souls in purgatory and for living benefactors who wished to improve their fates in the next world. Monks now enjoyed leisure and luxury. The monks at Cluny were given plentiful and choice foods. Their wardrobe was renewed annually. The manual labor prescribed by the rule of St. Benedict was reduced to entirely symbolic tasks about the kitchen. The monks lived like lords. But rather than living like lords, what they did was they used their money to hire a labor force and to create a very miniature little capitalistic system where they were paying wages to people who came and worked on these great estates. And there were thousands of acres of these estates. I think that monastery at Cluny, or he says, had what was like 100,000 acres. One in Hungary had fields totaling 250,000 acres. And much of the growth, he writes, was achieved by incorporating previously untilled tracts, as well as by clearing forests and draining submerged areas. And for example, monks at the monastery of Les Dunes recovered about 25,000 acres of fertile fields from the marshes along the Flanders coast. And all of this activity would have been unthinkable under the Roman Empire, just because there would have been no reason to do it. The idea of private property. This was a very Christian idea that early theologians were hammering out, was that private property is necessary, even though some of the monks were inclined more towards wanting communal property because they took vows of poverty. But the idea was that you should be free to not be interfered with. The government should not interfere with and take your property. Like the Roman Empire, on the other hand, there's no freedom and there's no private property there. If somebody, if the Roman Empire wants your stuff, they're going to come and they're going to take it. So that was an important precursor for the rise of capitalism, was this notion of private property and of treating it with a sense of frugality and this, what you would say, a capitalist ethic towards creating greater returns and improving the whatever you have been given in this life.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe to take it off from there, we'll come back to some of the points in the book, but I just want to comment on a few things kind of related. So in the critique of capitalism, like you pointed out, it was originally like a derogatory term. It was like critics of the economic system that first started using the word capitalist in a ways like they identified something bad and called it capitalism. And so I think, but it hasn't totally remained that way, like in the 150 years since that idea first started. Now you've got a whole bunch of different views of capitalism, so maybe we can kind of define what we mean by it. You already gave a good definition. Just really simple, like using money to make more money. But there are several ideas that are kind of underlying that, I think. For example, there's this one book I read recently by Nima Sanandaji, who is a Swedish-Iranian economist and kind of like policy guy. And it's this book, Birthplace of Capitalism, the Middle East. He basically argues that a lot of the ideas associated with capitalism, specifically like free market, and by free market, mostly from like an Austrian perspective, I might get into those distinctions, but a lot of those ideas, weren't developed primarily or firstly in Europe, in the times that we kind of think of it, in the past several hundred years. That the basic principles that a lot of like economists identify with capitalism cropped up first in the ancient Near East, like in Mesopotamia, in what is now like Iraq and Syria, and in ancient China, and in various of these areas that you found what were essentially capitalistic ideas. You had some of the first like proto corporations in India, and you had free market principles among the Native Americans, and Confucius and Mencius like talking about basic free market ideas like low taxation and private property, and the idea that exchanges should be free. And then you had contract law, and even in the first. The first writing was to basically keep track of economic records in Mesopotamia. And in the first laws, there were, some of the most important things were private property. And all the laws were about, theft and what to do in certain situations, like what to do if one person has property that someone else says was theirs and how to prove it and what to do in all these different cases. So some of the basic ideas or principles that get associated with capitalism. Now these are all contentious, of course, because the critiques of capitalism will say, "Oh, well, that's not capitalism," but then the self-declared capitalists will say, "Well, that's what I mean by capitalism," and then other people will say, "Well, I'm not a capitalist, but I believe in these principles." So it's going to be an endless debate, among partisans, but essentially, I'll take the position of the people that count themselves, or some of the people that would consider themselves like free market capitalists. Like the ideas are private property and like minimal government intervention, minimal state intervention in the operations of the economy, and basically like the free exchange of goods. So you are free to do with your money what you want to do with it. You are free to pay someone else for what you want to pay for it, and they're free to sell it to you for what they can get for it, essentially. And that's pretty much, there's more, of course, but that's pretty much the basics of it. So the free market would be essentially just letting people do what they will do on their own, with certain laws in place, right? So to protect property rights and to ensure kind of fair dealings, so that people aren't screwing each other over, but that a lot of the details get hammered out by the individuals themselves, as opposed to, say, the state or the empire dictating like everything in economic policy. So like high taxation, which of course the free marketeers would disagree with, and which a lot of these ancient cultures disagreed with. They said, well, it fluctuated, so back and forth between like state control and more free markets, but that the state should kind of be limited to just letting those things play out, and shouldn't get too involved in the economy. Especially, and that would reach its kind of epitome, or the most extreme version, in a totally planned economy, which is impossible because especially in a developed economy or a semi-developed economy, there are, for example, just dealing with prices. Like if you look at some anecdotes from the Soviet Union, there are millions of products basically, and that is millions of products to determine prices for. So Thomas Sowell, in one of his books, gives a good anecdote of in a paper written by these two Soviet economists who are basically responsible for doing this, for coming up with all these prices, and they're talking about how impossible it is to determine all these prices when there's millions of them, and so they would give quotas for how much to produce of what, and so there was one example, I think it was furs. So they wanted to lower the price of this certain fur, and so all of a sudden all the hunters were killing all of these animals. I don't know if it wasn't beavers, but it would something equivalent. So basically killing tons of beavers. So now the state had all of these extra beaver pelts, and they were just rotting in the warehouses because there was no demand for them. And this happened in kind of every sphere of the economy when you try to set prices like that. to such an extreme degree. So that would be the extreme. The extremes on the one hand are like a totally planned economy, which is impossible because there are so many variables that you would need. Like there's no way to coordinate all of that and to be able to constantly track prices and constantly track basically supply and demand in order to come up with the best price. It turns out that people are actually pretty good at that, at just determining it on their own, and that's what you would see in the kind of the more ancient free market like economies, like along the old Silk Road. It's like prices were determined, by the market, not by someone controlling the market. And when you say by the market, that is just the individuals engaging in these transactions. And even back in like ancient Iraq, you had people like keeping track of prices in the markets like on a weekly basis and observing this and trying to come up with the principles. And then it was only in like the past several hundred years that we've got our modern kind of economic theories that have come about. And so what we eventually have nowadays, we have various capitalisms because people like coming up with words and coming up with these speculative abstract systems to try to describe things and make sense of them, and therefore try to hopefully be able to produce a methodology like an economic practice that will conform with the theory in order to get good things. It doesn't always work that way, of course. So we now have multiple capitalisms. So, and there are various schools too. So like you've got free market capitalists, so, along the Milton Friedman type guys, and then you've got the more Austrian school who are different, who disagree on several points, who are more just kind of basic free market in the sense of libertarian, like let people just do what they do. But then there are the things that get associated with capitalism that aren't necessarily intrinsically part of capitalism. So there's this article I read last week. I just found it on a Google search. It's on the website for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute in the U.S. and it's called "Does Capitalism Destroy Culture?" by Michael Matheson Miller. And it's just a short little article. I mean, he makes some good points, but the main points he does make is that when looking at like capitalism, you have to make certain distinctions, because he points out that, for instance, this is something that Peter Berger argued, that you have to separate things that are intrinsic to capitalism from things that are extrinsic. So that would be like the cultural effects that are actually directly caused by capitalism, the effects that are aided and abetted by capitalism. So capitalism kind of helps them happen, but isn't the prime mover of them. And then all those things that exist alongside capitalism that are often conflated with capitalism. So this is what happens in a lot of these debates between capitalism and socialism, or any variation on those debate that you can find, that you'll get often people criticizing one version of capitalism and people defending a different version of capitalism, and sometimes they're completely different things. And so like coming back to the book, so it sounds like the developments that Stark is talking about to start out with are basically like the creation of some of these first kind of firms in the monasteries, for instance, where you have a group of individuals or monks who expand to a degree that they need to hire a labor force, and they end up making more money, so they have more money to do something with. So right there is kind of like, I'd say the kernel of maybe the first bone of contention is the nature of profit, because is profit bad? Is greed bad? Well, are those two things necessarily linked, right? Is any profit made immediately to be associated with greed? And where are the dividing lines precisely, right? So I'd say that at least in our like modern day economies everywhere, everyone tries to make at least some profit. Is that because they are all greedy? Well, no, because some people want to make. Some people aren't making enough to make a profit to begin with, right? They want to make more money in order to be able to live at a certain level. But then let's say that you have that level. If you can find such an ideal level, even in any individual case, like where exactly does that cut off? But say you can find it. Okay, here's the level at which you have just enough that you need in order to get by. Is it wrong to seek a profit anywhere above that? Well, probably not, right? If you're making like 5% more than that level, it's like, well, I think everyone would agree, well, that would be great, and it would be great to make even a bit more. Because what is, well, you go back, okay, I'm going to use a weird analogy. Think about squirrels, right? When a squirrel stores away its, the nuts that it's collecting for food, it takes more than it can. It tries to take more than it can fit in its mouth. Not because it's greedy, because it will be good to have those extra nuts around for when, for when times get scarce, right? So it's basically what your aims are, what your goals are for that money. And that's the point you made about these monks, is that they weren't just seeking money for money's sake, just to kind of like get a hoard of gold and cackle over it and be an evil kind of Scrooge McDuck. They were actually using it for something, and they had it was within a framework and a worldview in which that profit had there was a use for it. And it wasn't just devoted to enriching themselves for their own personal profit. There was something to which that money could be put, like some goal, some aim to which that could be put. And so right there's a distinction that needs to be made between like the actual pursuit of profit, which always sounds like, I even feel kind of dirty saying it just because it's such a it just sounds wrong, right? Oh, the pursuit of profit. It sounds like something some evil Scrooge McDuck would be doing, but that's not necessarily the case. Anytime you save something, anytime you make a little bit more for a little bit more than you have to make, just to survive, that's a normal, that seems just absolutely normal for me, for any human to not only want that, but that it's actually a good thing. Because with that profit, you can do so many different things with it, as opposed to just hoarding it and gloating. Like you can save it for an emergency. That's a good thing. You can invest it in something else to make more money. And is it a bad thing to have more money? Well, no, not in and of itself. But then the debate becomes, well, how much is too much more? And that's where a lot of the kind of criticism of capitalism comes into play, is that they see, okay, well, a little bit of profit is okay, but a lot of profit, millions times more than the poorest person is making, that's too much. And I can even, agree with that sentiment. Yeah, I can see where it comes from, and even myself, that rubs me the wrong way too. But it's like, what exactly are the principles involved, and where's the cutoff point? So maybe to get back to the book, we can talk a bit about, well, maybe either if there's anything relevant in the book, to what I just said, go with that, or if not, just bring up another point in this history, because I want to know more about how these things developed and where they went.
Okay, so I'll just begin with just addressing that final point that you made by reading the definition of capitalism that Stark provides, which is really concise. It's as concise as you can get for this complex topic. He writes, "Capitalism is an economic system wherein privately owned, relatively well-organized, and stable firms pursue complex commercial activities within a relatively free, unregulated market, taking a systematic, long-term approach to investing and reinvesting wealth, directly or indirectly, in productive activities involving a hired workforce and guided by anticipated and actual return." So the reason I think about that is because it makes me wonder, when we talk about these exorbitant amounts, this exorbitant display of inequality that you see is, between people in the West and, people in the other parts of the world. When we're talking about this exorbitant amount of money, I wonder if we're really talking about capitalism at that point, when we're looking at this kind of I wonder more if it's in line with what he was talking about with the Roman Empire. Is this an imperial type thing that we're seeing, and it's not capitalism proper in the sense that these just firms that are taking in money and then just reinvesting it, in the activities in order to be more productive. Because as you're saying here, if you're a squirrel and you are so bloated on squirrels that you're dying, You're not reinvesting here on nuts. I mean that you're dying, and squirrels too, maybe in some of these firms. Is that capitalism? I would argue that in many ways it's not. No, what we're really saying when we're critiquing it is we're critiquing this more imperial type, just exorbitant consumption. I'm just so rich and I love it. That's, to me, that's not really free market capitalism, and I'm sure that's debatable. But yeah, that's what I thought of when you were discussing that huge wealth gap.
What about? So you've talked about the monasteries, right, and their kind of development of, these proto firms. But what does he have to say about, like, how that developed later on? Kind of like, was there in his argument, was there like a Christian aspect to the rise of capitalism as we think of it nowadays? So just the total economic system that Europe has developed over the last few hundred years. Like, what does he have to say about that?
Well, there's a lot of it is based on his idea that it's these Christian ideals that were originated in these monasteries where they basically forged capitalism, and then you skip forward in time, and there's in other places the same type thing starts to occur. So he traces it back. First time you see these stable, well-run, organized firms engaging in capitalist pursuits were these monasteries. But then when you look in like the 13th, 14th century at the Italian city-states, you see a similar thing. But they are also functioning under similar constraints as these monasteries were, in the sense that they have relative freedom. They are, of course, they're Catholic, but they also have the ability to play off different imperial powers against one another, so that it's like it's like the conditions in the monastery, but in the real world, because they have just the right geography, the right ways of transporting goods here and there, and then the fact that they can play off imperial powers against one another, that they have a sufficient amount of freedom to engage in the exact same pursuit. And so then in these Italian city-states, he goes to point out how in the less free places where there's tyranny and people are having all their stuff stolen, and there's no way that you can lend to somebody without this ruler being like, well, you know what, I decided not to pay it back because I'm the king. When you, in one situation, the Catholic Church actually excommunicated a king because he refused to pay back, it might not have been a king, I can't remember, I think it was a prince, a lord or something, but he refused to pay back a loan. They excommunicated him and made him pay it back at 50% interest over 8 years. But anyways, within these Italian city-states, you had the conditions in order to pursue capitalism, and they went about it with a huge amount of fervor in creating the educational institutions where they created this capitalist class that was able to calculate interests and to devise ways of managing firms long term and stably, and then they outsourced that to other areas of Europe. So then you started to see more capitalistic type activities taking place in England and in other areas where there was enough freedom from warfare, from tyranny, and yet still enough ingenuity and desire for this kind of efficient way of reusing your wealth in order to create these stable and long-term forward-looking firms.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Is I was going to ask, why does Stark think this is a good thing? This kind of gets to the the debate, really. The anti-capitalist perspective is, why was the development of why does he see the development of capitalism as a good thing, as opposed to the way that a lot of anti-capitalists would see it, is like, well, this would just be another arrow in their quiver for attacking capitalism and Christianity, is that the two went together. Mm-hmm. So why does he think that we should kind of see this as a good thing?
Right. Well, so what the name of his book is The Victory of Reason: How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success. Mm-hmm. So basically, if you don't like West at all, I mean, you're like, oh, so exactly. There's another reason to hate Christianity, because it led to, quote unquote freedom, and the West, colonizing the rest of the world. Well, I think on the one point is that he is, Western centric. Obviously, that's one aspect, is that he's not as bad. It doesn't. He comes across sometimes as the West is the best, and that's just a part of being, I guess, a Westerner. For a lot of people, that's just how they see their own culture, is that it's the best. But another reason is that he ties them to these ideals that, as we've discussed, seem to be in practice the best kinds of ideas that you can have about your role in life and how to interact with other people and chart your course into the future. Is that you should consider yourself as being an individual person, individual moral agent that has to answer to what your creator, the higher God, and that in this way, like we were talking about these early monks, when faced with what do we do with all of this money, they chose not to just use it for lavish displays of consumption, but rather to reinvest it in the community, in their own estates, and into creating an order, a habitable order that as we see years on, it manifested in things like the Notre Dame Cathedral and other great huge monuments to this sense of the beauty in the cosmos, the beauty of God on earth. And that, I think, is he's a sociologist of religion, and he's written so many different books on Christianity. So he is obviously he comes at it from a Christian kind of, background and then, for people in the West who, are conservative and traditional, obviously are going to have a fondness for Christianity, because that's where that's where our culture came from. And so I understand what you're saying, but still, capitalism, is it really good? Is it really good? Well, he would argue, and then he argues in the book, that yes, the capitalism that we're discussing as a technique to use wealth, to increase wealth, is a good thing. It's a rational thing to do. It's reasonable. And when you look at all the different ways that you can use your money, it seems to me that it's probably the most rational way to reinvest your money that we know of at this point. But the fact is that you can't analyze an economic system without looking at all of the other different aspects of a society, like you pointed out. There are, society has so many different centers of gravity and different ways of viewing the world. You have the arts, you have your technological achievements, you have your religious views, your moral views, you have your social connections and whatever ethnic stripes, or all of those different things that all feed into what a culture is. And then not even factoring in the hierarchical aspect of it, the levels of inequality, and then also the spiritual hierarchy, whether or not the society has a higher view of life than just a primitive desire to accumulate wealth. I think that when you factor all those things in, then you see that capitalism is just a technique of economic activity that seems very rational, but you can also be completely irrational in the religious sense. So you could inherit the most rational capitalist firm, and yet you can use the wealth not to redistribute it into your firm and to create greater forms of efficient productivity, but you can use it for lavish displays of consumption, or people, the morals, the society could have moral decay so that everybody's just sheep. Everyone sees one another as just another sucker born every minute, and So though, when you take those things into consideration, you can see how capitalism can become evil, can become polarized, I guess, for lack of a better word, just because there's so many different cycles that society goes through. So when you look at Best Buy today, or Goldman Sachs, let's take Goldman Sachs or something like, and then you compare it to the monastic estates that were loaning. They were loaning to individuals, and they were practicing usury. These early Christian communities, but they did not have quite near the same reputation as Goldman Sachs has today.
Well, maybe moving on to, I want to get to this article that I mentioned, Does Capitalism Destroy Culture? The main point that he makes, which is one that I've thought of before, is this idea of like what he calls the solipsistic individualism and consumerism. So this goes back to the last point you made, Corey, about the way in which, or the way to see capitalism as kind of like a tool, and that of course it can be used just like any tool for different types of purposes. And when you look at capitalism and the critique of capitalism, the two things to separate are just the economic principles involved in a system, in a society, but also the cultural kind of baggage that gets associated with it. So in the example of like Western capitalism seen as this kind of individualistic, consumeristic society, that is the case, but those phenomena are distinct. They just happen to be combined. Like capitalism by itself does not need to necessarily and inexorably lead to a consumerist society. Like you said, like the monks practicing this early form of capitalism weren't consumerist, total individualists. I mean, if anything, they were collectivists, but they had this collectivists in the sense of living in a monastery and sharing resources amongst each other, and but taking vows of poverty too. But there is a type of individualism involved, like that you mentioned, that Stark mentions, this idea of seeing yourself as an individual, seeing everyone as an individual with their own responsibilities, and with what we'd call today with the rights that come with those responsibilities too. They would see it as like the divinity within each individual, the value within each individual. But then there's a different type of individualism. I think I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a few weeks ago. The different types of individualism. Like there is this kind of like toxic individualism, which is really just selfishness, self-centeredness, like seeing yourself as more important and others as not even having any value or very little value. And then the idea, so that I'd say that's like pathological individualism compared to just individualism in the sense that I just mentioned. Like everyone has a spark of the divine, everyone is responsible for their own actions, and everyone has like a responsibility kind of like within themselves to develop themselves, to live up to their potential, to be responsible in the world for yourself and for others and for the world in general. Like that's really the positive aspect of individualism. So when you look at the West, we don't see a lot of that individualism, that type of individualism. We do see, well, I don't know, that's debatable, but we do see a lot of like pathological individualism, the kind of me first attitude. And so what this guy in this article calls that is basically the radical concept of autonomy, and that that is one aspect, but it happens to be tied with in a materialistic like capitalist culture, but it is one element of it is one aspect, one characteristic that is combined to make that world, that system. But you can have, and you do have, cultures that practice some form of capitalism that have free markets that aren't so individualistic in the negative sense, aren't so solipsistic, aren't so materialistic. And that's the other thing, is the materialism of it. That like, so you brought up these monks, and we can go back to like the free market practices developed by the Arabs and by the Muslims So the Arab Muslims, and even before that, so before Islam was a thing, even you had free market practices, and they all had belief systems which were anything but materialistic. Like all of these early instances of capitalism and free markets were in like very like either religious cultures or religious or cultures with a very like developed like spiritual like philosophy. These were not materialistic cultures. So the two can coexist. Well, they can exist apart from each other or together. They're not necessarily linked in any way. So what we have today is really like a combination of some great things and some really bad things. And when you get a combination like that, you can have good developments and you have bad developments at the same time. And it's tough to tease them out. It's tough to see. It's tough to really like identify what the positives and what the negatives are. I think you can do it, not necessarily perfectly, but you can get some idea. So in the West, there are still good things about capitalism, even as it is practiced, arguably. If we even just look at the base level of people's quality of life, the base level is pretty good comparatively. There are still things that you can identify as bad and not ideal in any sense, but really comparing like the people in the lowest 10% of even like the United States, which is seen as the kind of global center of capitalism, which is arguable too. But even those lower 10% are living a lot better than people were living even 200 years ago. And just like you can't kind of write off the good things about the past, that like the positive developments that came out of Christianity, you can't really write off the things that are actually arguably good things that have come out of capitalism, no matter how much you hate capitalism. Like you're still benefiting in some way, even if you might be resentful for it. That's still there. But you've also got some negatives. So negatives about the overall culture, not necessarily just about capitalism. So in the development of like the worldview of the West over the past few hundred years, there's the argument that like the Enlightenment was a great thing. And again, arguably, good things came out of the Enlightenment, but there were also some bad things that came out of it. One of the things that came out of the Enlightenment and all the philosophies that developed was this first of all, this split between the Cartesian split between mind and matter, which gave by seeing reality as two separate, distinct substances, and matter as this mechanistic thing going on, and then mind as this kind of divinely gifted ability, the soul. After that division, once science developed and religion was criticized enough, with no reason to believe in God, all you were left with was the mechanistic universe, and without the mind being an essential part of that universe, you were just left with the mechanism, and that led to the development of all these different philosophies over the past several hundred years that don't have any divinity in them. That they are these mechanistic philosophies. So what we have nowadays is a materialistic philosophy, a materialistic worldview that this has nothing essential to do with capitalism. This can be strictly divorced from capitalism. It may have grown up in a capitalist environment, but the ideas themselves aren't in any way essentially tied to an economic theory even. Some economic theories have adopted these philosophies, but that's, again, just how these things have combined. So you have this worldview, whether you're aware of it or not, the conclusions, like the logical conclusions of these philosophies, even if you're aware of them or not, are that, for instance, there is no such thing as objective morality. So there is no such thing as anything that is intrinsically better or worse than anything else, and that there is that basically it leads to a kind of determinism or a kind of a world in which there is no personal responsibility. There is no thing that is essentially and like in and of itself better or worse than another, and while that's a totally like wrong-headed philosophy because it's inherently like inconsistent and self-contradictory, it provides like the raw material, even on an unconscious level, for people not to value things that are truly valuable and to therefore value themselves more than they are worthy of being valued. So that leads to this really like pathological selfishness and self-centeredness, where you get this because there's no reason to believe that you should be living your life in like a virtuous manner. That leaves you free to just operate on your own base instincts. And when you cut off that kind of controlling, like frontal lobe kind of inhibition on your worst impulses, then that leaves those worst impulses just to play themselves out like mechanistically, automatically. And that's, I think, what we see in I think that probably gets to the heart of the like why capitalism is bad more than anything else, because it's not actually capitalism. It is really the philosophy or the religion that you're living by, whether you're aware of it or not. This comes back to the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson debate that we talked about months ago, where the point Peterson makes repeatedly, and which I think is absolutely correct, is that no matter what you think you believe, no matter what you say you believe, like your actions are kind of predicated on an unconscious belief system, which he calls a hierarchy of values, right? You no matter what you do, no matter what you perceive, say, or do, it is the acting upon a system, a hierarchy of values of some sort. If you haven't defined those values, and if you actually reject a system of those values, the way it seems to happen is that if just left to your own devices, then you act on the lowest part of yourself. If you don't define your hierarchy of values, or if you don't have it defined for you, that would be kind of like the ideal situation would be that you have the raw material available around you from which you can form your own hierarchy of values, like using your own reason, using your own conscience. But barring that, the next best thing would be to have a society that basically has a system of morals in place that if you follow it, even without thinking, you'd at least be better off than not having such a system. But we don't even have that so much. It is there, but it's not quite in the form. It's not even quite in the form where that would be a good thing, because you have this system where all these people are don't really have that star, to guide them. They do have a system that reinforces the worst things about themselves, that does reinforce the consumeristic and self-centered aspects of your own personality. So in such a situation where you have society which provides the raw material for those beliefs, and you have the lack of an internal structure guiding your own morality, your own behavior, that it puts you in the worst of both worlds, where you can't make the right choice because you're not even aware that there is a right choice to make, and oftentimes you deny that there is a right choice to make, that there is a better choice to make. Now combine that with capitalism, and you get the worst aspects of capitalism, so-called, which again I don't really think are even like capitalistic. They're facilitated by capitalism, and capitalism facilitates them. Like they can work they can do an evil tango together, but that tango, each of those dancers can be separated, and capitalism on its own, within a philosophy and a worldview and a religion, like within a hierarchy of values that is more healthy, it doesn't need to go in the same direction. Essentially, you can have monks making a lot of money that are still doing something for their community, and yeah. Anything to say about that?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with what you've just said. That was the only thing I can think of is when I'm thinking about this this capitalistic ethic, and this drive to acquire wealth. I think the conditions that we are in now, in the West, aren't that much different than privileged, Roman senators or the elite of any other system in history, where life is good, other people are doing the work for you, even if you are, working, but life is still good. And well, what else are you going to do? Let's be hedonistic, consume, and enjoy your life. So as you pointed out, it's not capitalism. It's more of just a confluence of many other things that capitalism fed into, but there's also more to do with the lack of an aim, an aim to live, an aim to live by. And if Stark is correct, then the capitalism originated in the bosom of Christianity, and so you'd imagine that in those conditions, that's where it functioned best. And when you look back on it, especially where with the Christian monasteries and with kind of a Protestant ethic, and with people who are explicitly aware of their value hierarchy because it was given to them, then all of these activities make sense and they're kind of balanced out. Your rights and responsibilities are balanced out. As Jordan Peterson points out, we have all these discussions about rights, but we never really talk about responsibilities. Well, in Christianity, they went hand in hand. Our rights and our political rights and our rights, how we should treat one another, how we should be treated. These were all very, big ideas in the forefront of Christian thinking and Christian morality. But then we also had a responsibility in order not to sin. Sinning, that was the capital crime. Don't do all of these things. Behave correctly. Behave properly. Aim true. Think of Christ. Live in Christ. Live as you would think Christ would want you to live. All of this was a huge burden of responsibility that obviously it produced a lot of guilt, produced a lot of shame, but then it also produced the kind of suffering, kind of conscious suffering in order to, improve your life. The kind of suffering that does not go hand in hand with just eating Jolly Ranchers and watching TV and, eating Taco Bell and then complaining about everything. We have the fruits of this, this capitalist ethic that apparently was informed very strongly by Christianity, but we don't have the Christianity. We're like zombies. Mm-hmm. We're like Christian zombies. It's very strange. Not just Christian zombies, but zombies in general. We're just, where a lot of us are the Walking Dead, and that's why you see the nihilism, the large increase in drug addiction, and why we have an economic system that seems to have just kicked so many people overboard, and just watching so many of them drown. It's not just capitalism's fault, because as we've been saying, it is a tool. It is a part of the economic, structure that we chose. Our ancestors chose to do things this way. And they chose to do these things this way because arguably they worked and they were successful. They made money. They established firms. They established, large families. They were able to live better off than the generation they did before them. But, not everything is just pure progress, clearly. And as you pointed out, Harrison, there's been a big gap between our capability for technological and economic achievements and our more moral and religious achievements. We've pretty much abandoned the latter as being unimportant, but they're not unimportant, not by any means, not by any stretch of the imagination. Our religious values and having a consciously structured hierarchy of values unimportant, because as we've seen, they lead to chaos. Lacking that leads to aimlessness. Aimlessness leads to a bunch of zombies, and then zombies lead to chaos. And then pretty soon everybody's like, what the heck happened? Well, 200 years ago, you kicked your reason for living overboard and then went hog wild, creating all different kinds of sodas to sell all over the world. But, obviously a lot of that, all of that economic activity is is just part of us, part of humanity. As you pointed out, like this capitalism, it goes all the way back to, the ancient Near East. There's roots of it there, but I mean that's just economic activity in general, and it's been a long ways to develop this system. It's been it's taken a confluence of a bunch of different factors, and then turns out, if Stark's right, these factors are highly positive. Is a very positive set of ideals, and being capitalistic, in the sense that you establish frugal firms that are stable and managed and supervised, and that can exist to reinvest the wealth into greater and greater amounts of wealth. It's not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but I can still say that there is a definite evil that arises when you create these said firms, and that is that you introduce into a society a new life form, essentially a new life form that has its own reasons to live, its own ways of gaining sustenance. It's not the church, it's not the government. It's something completely different that doesn't really necessarily owe its allegiances to the church or the government. This firm takes on a life of its own. So the Chinese, they didn't view private property very favorably, because they viewed it as being unstable, inherently unstable. And it is, and especially in the form of creating these capitalistic firms, because you create these entities that accrue their own power, and they're unaccountable, and they grow and metastasize within society. I mean, for better or for worse. I don't like to use the term metastasize because that makes it sound inherently cancerous. But it's still true that you gain these new little fiefdoms, these new little kingdoms within a society. And when you look at America, one of the problems I think that you see in like American style capitalism is that you don't have, like you're talking about, this hierarchy of values, this strong set of principles that says, this is our country, the government is, the president has this kind of authority. You are all insubordinate to this centralized authority. You have this globalist, kind of this globalist mentality. Whereas in China, as Zizek pointed out in the debate with Jordan Peterson, you have a very strong and centralized state that can force the capitalists to reinvest in the country, which it seems like a very capitalist, idea. Okay, so we got all this wealth, let's reinvest it here in the country. Well, all of these different firms without a centrally, unifying kind of a command structure, why reinvest it in the country? Just reinvest it in my firm, but I'll reinvest it in my firm in this other country or that other country or whatever. You don't have this centralized authority to really make those, to make some discussions. And then obviously if you did, then you'd have questions like, well, is that really the free market? But then you run into the questions of how free should the market be? Because so maybe, like as they've pointed out, with this globalization, and Western companies and just corporations in general going, around the world to find, cheap labor or whatever, it's benefited other people. So it could just be the case that, a rising tide raises all boats, but, that the tide was so low in other places that our boats are going to have to sink quite a bit before everybody's boat, gets back up to the same level. However, there is such a lack of debate, a lack of discussion about it, that it's, you've got this just kind of haphazard set of free market economies or free market firms that are just reinvesting in their own firm and for whatever, just doing whatever will maximize their own profit, which, that's part of the core critique of capitalism, is that these firms don't really have their own allegiance. They have their own imperatives that that may or may not coincide with the imperatives of the town in which they operate. But also part of the free market is that over time, they still have to pay the price if they,
Right.
if you are going to piss off all your consumers, you have to pay the price, sooner or later. If you pollute their towns or you pollute this and that, there's still some natural consequences to that kind of behavior.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make. This idea of the firms as these new fiefdoms, the kings of their own castles, reminds me of like a book I've been listening to by Murray Rothbard, who is a Austrian economist on the progressive era. So he actually looked at all of these dynamics in like the late 1800s in the United States, and the example he gave was that he kind of I think he might agree that a lot of these firms, like whether it was in the railways or the oil companies or he gives like 5 different like types of corporations that were existing at the time. Whatever they were, it's like a lot of them were, and he makes this point clear, they were in it for themselves, right? They wanted to make as much profit as possible. They wanted to be the only guy in town. They wanted to get rid of their competition. But the point that he makes is that never worked. That there were always consequences for like bad decision making and even like immoral decision making. It's like these guys all had it coming, and it came eventually. But if it didn't come eventually, the reason that these firms were able to survive was because they got in bed with the government, who basically like subsidized them and maybe made them like a state monopoly. They gave them the power to stay in power in their own fiefdoms and basically survive. Whereas they were either in the process of being like defeated in the competitive free market because of their own mistakes, because of their own like poor decision making and poor planning and poor management. And the companies that he basically argues that until the 1890s, early 1900s, that America was like very much more a free market economy than it became, and that with the progressive era, that was when a lot of the more kind of state interventionist like policies started being implemented with the creation of like state monopolies and subsidized firms and things like this. But before that, like even Standard Oil, he points out that first of all, there's no evidence that Standard Oil ever engaged in predatory pricing, for instance. The way that Standard Oil got so big was by buying up all the competition. But even that proved to be a downside, because when people saw that Standard was buying up all of these new like oil firms, they just essentially created fake firms, like fake operations with fake factories and fake things, and started selling them to Standard. Standard would buy them and then realize that they'd bought like nothing. Essentially, they just wasted however many hundreds of thousands of dollars buying this company that didn't actually exist. And new companies were like popping up as competition to Standard Oil. And Standard, like I think the highest like market share it had at any one point was like maybe 95% or something. And that was steadily going down before the antitrust suit against Standard. But he shows examples of this in all of these different areas where it was the consequences of the market that basically punished these companies for being such jerks, essentially, such capitalist jerks. And that's the kind of myth is that there's a few like interconnected myths about like economics in general, but this period of history in particular, about why certain policies got put into place, what's like economic practices work or don't, like the ills or goods of competition, where essentially like what a lot of capitalist critics I think don't get is just how when you look at least this type of free market capitalism, how pro-consumer it is. That is like pro you as a buyer, even not even as the owner of a corporation. Is that one of the reasons that all of these corporations were looking for like state intervention, it was because they wanted to charge more and they couldn't, because there were other companies that were giving a good deal to the consumer base. People were like, oh, look, I can get this, I can pay for this like train ride, or I can buy this product for less money, and that's a good thing. And all these other all these competitive evil corporations were happy to do that. And then the big corporations were like, well, no, we can't have that. That means we make less money. That's where the greed enters. Like the greed enters when you want to stop competition and eat up the market share for yourself and eliminate that competition. But the only way to achieve that, at least looking at this history and like through this type of analysis, like Rothbard argues, the only way for that to actually happen is for the government to intervene, for the government and the big corporations to actually get into bed together to make that happen. Because left to their own devices, it doesn't work. Because new corporations do show up that are able to undercut the big firms, and because one of the reasons that takes place is because the big firms, the big established companies and corporations, they have all of this old infrastructure. This is just one reason. They're using old technology and they don't want to update. They don't want to innovate. They can't innovate and they don't want to innovate because they want to keep their profits where they are. And to invest more money in themselves would be to lose out on those profits. So you get a new company that has the latest technology that comes in and says, "Oh, well, I can do this better than this giant corporation can do, and I can charge a lower price." And that company then grows, and the big company gets resentful, and it's like, "Well, I don't like this. I don't like them like taking a bit of my pie." It's actually the free market. These other corporations that are actually acting as a like a dampener on the greed, the nasty bit of capitalism. These big capitalists. So why would you want to eliminate like capitalism, which is this competition that goes against this greed aspect, arguably because of the greed of this other corporation, but that's another issue. That seems to be the strange direction that anti-capitalists go in. Is that okay? Well, we should take away the freedom for that other firm to come in. Well, this is what it essentially amounts to. We should take away the freedom for that other firm to come in and do a better job than the big firm. That's essentially what it amounts to. And that, unfortunately, that is the type of capitalism we have like today, especially in the United States, is this type of capitalism that benefits the big corporations because of the links between the government and the big corporations, because there isn't a free competitive market, because and this has to do with like regulatory capture and all sorts of things like that. The lobbying and the revolving door of boards of directors and government and the backroom deals that they make with each other in order to give themselves an unfair advantage. Really, that's the thing. It's an unfair advantage. A fair advantage would be not to have special privileges and to just let them like duke it out on the market, essentially. So I would argue that it's even like the free market system, the free exchange and the free competition is actually probably the most moral system that you could put in place, because people are free to be evil, people are free to be good, people are free to either punish the bad guys or that they perceive as bad, or to do as much good as possible as they can. When you remove that freedom, then you're basically dictating a moral outlook, and that is the worst form of totalitarianism, I think. When you tell a person what the good and the bad thing to do is, and then strictly enforce it and don't give them any freedom to actually make the choice on their own, to actually give people the freedom to make their own choices, is, I think, what comes out of this. Coming back to this book, this Christian idea of you are your own individual, you have your own responsibilities. It is your job to figure out what is right and wrong, not necessarily to come up with your own ideas about what are right or what are right or wrong, but to discover them, because there are things there are objective goods and objective evils. It's difficult to figure them out, but it really does come down to the individual to understand for themselves and to discover for themselves what those are. So there, I just gave a religious defense of capitalism. I don't know how good it was, but
I'm sold. Well, it reminds me of what Alfred White Northhead said about
North
coercive. What did I say? Alfred North Whitehead.
Yeah.
Sorry. About coercive versus persuasive influence. Especially from the perspective of God. That either you're forcing people to make this decision because that's just this is the authoritarian approach, or it's the coercive, like, yeah, well, you should try this, or or the persuasive. And you're like, well, why don't you give this shot? Give this a shot. What entices you? What do you want to do? What is within you that that you want to bring out? And that's when you're talking about the free market. That's persuasive at the utmost, and it's you look around, you see what is your calling, that's from the Protestant ethic. What is your calling in the world? What is God calling you to do in the world? And that becomes your profession. That's like all of these religious undertones to careers and callings, and living your potential on the planet. All of these things have been argued before by many different sociologists, and Rodney Stark being one, that this obviously had its roots in the Christian idea of this persuasive power of God, that he's persuading you to come out into reality. He's persuading you to become something. And economic activity was just one aspect. That was just one aspect of many, but that had its roots in Christian theology.
All right. Well, with that said, I think we've talked enough for today. So, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.